Now, I bet you don't know a preacher who, in addition to his pastoral duties, successfully hunts elk with a bow, has managed a multi-million dollar organization operating in several foreign countries, which aids in building hundreds of churches and facilitates the training of thousands of pastors, who has smuggled $50,000 in cash strapped to his chest into a communist country to help a church build a library. well, well, I was fortunate to be able to interview him last week in his home, where he informed me about those things and more. And I'm delighted to introduce him to you so he can tell you. Meet the Reverend Stephen Speed Bryant, Jr. Okay, we're going to get this thing started. We are in the home of Stephen Bryant. And as I told you in the little introduction, I want you to meet him as a pastor, preacher, guitarist, father, grandfather, woodworker, outdoorsman, gardener, world traveler, and businessman, in addition to being, on one occasion at least, a smuggler. We're in his home right now, and he also, I said outdoorsman, he also hunts with a bow. And that's something that I haven't done yet. But I just thought he's done so many things, and it's been such an interesting background. Steve, if it's okay with you, we'll just start with Greenwood, son, and come on, up to the present time. You grew up in Greenwood, right?
Yes, sir. I sure did.
And you have sort of some backgrounds as Presbyterian ministers, right?
A little bit.
Only about how many generations?
Well, my father is a retired Presbyterian minister who served in Greenwood and in Nashville and other places. My grandfather was a Presbyterian minister and missionary and a professor at Columbia Theological Seminary. And my great-grandfather, this is all on my dad's side, my great-grandfather was a pastor in Atlanta and was also a moderator of the Presbyterian Church in 1960. So there's a little bit in my blood to do this work.
Well, honestly, did that have a great bearing on what you decided to do?
As far as
ministry,
my family pressure to go into the family business?
Yeah.
No, it never was. In fact, it was kind of the opposite. I can remember talking to my dad about being a preacher one day when I was still just a kid, and that that thought was put in my mind. I think by the Spirit Himself, but also communicated through others, not necessarily my family, but other people in the church. Little old ladies on Sunday mornings would tweak my cheek and say, "You're going to be a preacher just like your daddy," and that was a wonderful thing to hear when I was little.
Yeah.
And then the older I got, the more I wasn't so sure about that. And I can remember talking to my dad about it, and his advice was, well, son, if you can do anything else, for goodness sake, do that. Explore all kinds of things before you make up your mind, because to go into this work really requires a deep sense of calling in order for there to be some fulfillment and happiness. So, the family never pressured me. I had experiences throughout the course of my childhood that really helped me to sort through this. And some of the experiences had to do with, I spent 2 summers down in the Yucatan when I was just a kid. First time I was 13 years old, doing construction work for the Mexican Presbyterian Church. And those experiences, being away from Greenwood and being away from my family and being away from everything that I knew and found comfort in, and really trusting in God and letting Him work through me. Those were the kind of experiences that really shaped what became a calling to ministry.
Well, so that blue stocking Presbyterian blood ran through you, pretty strong. Huh?
It does, yeah. And I'm very thankful of that, and I'm proud of that.
Oh, sure. Well, you graduated high school there in Greenwood,
yeah.
And then went on to Ole Miss.
I did.
Where unfortunately you were a member of Phi Delta Theta.
I sure
right?
was, yeah.
It was right up the road from my outfit when I was at Ole Miss. You'll notice some polish about this man, and then of course the Ole Miss stuff, rubbed off on him, which I'm very pleased with. Okay, well let's start from there. You went from Ole Miss and
straight to seminary, Columbia Theological Seminary, and studied there. Received a Master of Divinity from Columbia, and a part of that education was to be placed in churches. So I served, while I was in seminary, I was always working in a church somewhere in that area. But I took a year off and went to Kingsport, Tennessee to work as an intern for Danny Massey, and anybody in Canton, Mississippi will know that name. Danny grew up here in Canton and grew up in the church that I now serve. So Danny, although I had great lineage and people like my dad and my grandfather to look up to and learn from, Danny was really a mentor who invested a tremendous amount of time in me during that time. So I served him, and I learned quite a bit. He opened up a spot for me to come back to after I finished seminary. So I was his associate for 3 years afterwards. And then I served a church in Winter Haven, Florida, and moved from there to Vicksburg, Mississippi, and then to Madison. And then I had a brief stint in and out of Africa for about 5 years. And now I'm serving First Pres here in Canton and love it.
Well, let's talk about that 5 years in Africa.
Sure.
You were actually, I guess, employed by.
Yes.
Tell us about that foundation.
Well, I worked for a great man who passed away in 2017. His name is Dr. Alex Booth. And Alex was from West Virginia. He made a tremendous amount of money in the coal industry with his family. But as a very young man, he had a heart for missions, particularly in Africa. And he decided before he ever made much money at all, that he would take half of his wealth and use that to do all the good that he can do in the world. And sure enough, he did. So over the course of his life, he contributed millions and millions of dollars, particularly to the training of leadership for the churches in Africa, for large, mostly Presbyterian, but not exclusively Presbyterian, for large denominations all over sub-Saharan Africa. When he reached the point where he was not able to make those very difficult trips, he hired me to run that operation for him. And so for 5 years until his death, I served him full-time and made many trips to various countries in Africa to not only facilitate the work that he had started, but to open up new work, which he funded. And that was a rich experience, an incredible opportunity a great blessing that I'm very, very thankful for.
So specifically though, what were you? You were training pastors, right? And also going through construction of churches, right?
Yes, yes.
Building them.
Yeah,
Actually.
the African church is actually Christianity in sub-Saharan Africa is growing faster than anywhere else in the world. And so some of the fastest growing Protestant denominations are located in Africa, in Ethiopia and other places. So what Alex had begun to do, and what he entrusted me to carry on, was to work with the leadership of various denominations. We worked in 8 different countries to provide the resources and in some cases the administrative leadership and some guidance to help the African church develop its own leadership. Alex learned years and years ago that the model that we had all been depending upon for several hundred years was to send a white American missionary to somewhere in Africa to become the leadership, essentially. And that is not the best model. That's more of a colonial kind of model. So Alex began to work directly with the African leadership to provide them with the resources that they needed to develop their own leadership. So we had training facilities in 8 different countries that served students that came from 11 countries in total, all across sub-Saharan Africa, from Ghana to Ethiopia, all the way down as far as Zimbabwe, and everything in between.
How many people did you train?
Over the course of that 5 years, I didn't personally train them, but I worked with facilitators and others who would actually do the training in many different spots. But over the course of my work with Alex, we trained 5,000 pastors. 5,000 pastors. And the training it's different from what I went through at Columbia. I went through essentially my program was a 4-year master's level program. But 4 years or 3 years to try to obtain the equivalent of a master's degree in Africa may not be the best approach. And it is the approach for some. There's a high bar for clergy. But the churches that are thriving are the churches that are not served by somebody like me that has a master's in divinity. The churches that are thriving are served by lay people, people that have a heart for it and a true calling for it and what they need. They've got some education, but what they need is to be able to absorb as much biblical, pastoral, historical, theological information that they can in as short amount of time as they can. So we had a 1-year program, and it was intensive, and it was a residency. So people in all these different facilities that we had in 8 different countries would come. They'd be there for a year. Oftentimes they'd bring their whole family with them, and we would provide the resources to train them and the resources to feed them and clothe them and educate their kids for the course of that year. We also provided, because of the context, an African pastor typically is not going to get paid for his work. And so we provided them with sustainability training, which would come in the form of intensive training in agriculture or in a trade. We would teach people how to weld, how to become carpenters, how to be plumbers, how to do masonry, and provide them with the tools that they needed, whether it's seed or livestock or welding equipment or hammers and wrenches. We would provide them with the tools that they needed so that they could go forward under the banner of their respective denomination or church governing body and plant churches, lead people to Christ and build up the church, but have a means of taking care of their family, providing for themselves. And it was just that was such an exciting thing to be a part of. And what excited me as much as anything else was to sit down in a classroom with a group of 20 or 30 people that are about to go out and start planting churches, who are trying to learn how to be more productive in raising chickens or growing crops, pumpkins or tomatoes or whatever it might be. It was just an amazing experience.
But while all this was going on, all this training, you were also facilitating building the physical churches.
That's
were
right.
you not?
Because the measure, and this was something that Alex Booth had been a part of church construction many, many years ago. And it became increasingly complicated for him to be able to do that. He was living here in the States, and he was not able to travel, and he's trying to fund church construction. And so there were problems. There was corruption. There were all kinds of things. And so when I took on this work for him, one of the issues was, how do you measure the success of the work that we're doing? And one measure would be the number of people that you train. But then what happens to it? You can invest money and time into training somebody to be a pastor or an evangelist, but that's not the end game. The end game is for that person to go out and begin to draw people closer to Christ. And how do you measure that? Well, I think the way that you measure that is through a church. So the graduates of our program would go forward and begin to plant churches. And it was an incredible thing to witness that, one African pastor who had gone through our Booth Leadership Initiative training wouldn't just go out and try to plant one church, but multiple churches at a time, sometimes 5 or 6 churches in a geographic area that they have to walk to each church, or they ride a bike, or maybe they might have a little scooter or something. But one pastor is at any given time, he is working very hard to plant multiple churches. And so how do you measure that work? It's in people who are coming together to worship God. And a very easy way to measure that is through a structure. The church is not a building, but a building is often necessary for the church to be able to have a suitable place to worship, have a place to educate their kids during the week, have a place for the doctor to set up a clinic when they might be passing through a village. And so when a pastor would go out and plant a church and assemble a group of people, usually from 75 to maybe 100 people, then we would partner with those denominations and with those pastors to help them build a suitable facility. And we built the last year in 2017, the last year that Alex was alive, we funded the construction of 420 churches.
How many total do you think y'all did in the whole, for 5 years you were there?
That was the biggest year that we had, and it started from nothing when I first started doing this work. And we were probably at 900 to 1,000 churches total. And when I say church, you don't think about First Presbyterian Church or First Baptist Church, these big, giant, beautiful edifices that are just a church in that context, in all of these countries, it's pretty much the same. You see the same thing everywhere you go. It's a brick, handmade brick, big, heavy bricks. A brick building, usually from 30 feet wide, 60 feet long, with a metal roof on it. Well, the supplies that you need to bring it all the way up to the roof line are right there. So the members of the church would, once they had the resources to know that a roof was coming, the members of the church would begin to make bricks by hand, fire them on site, and usually the women would lay the bricks all the way up to the roof line, plaster by hand the inside and outside, and then we would provide them with the funding that they needed to put a long-term roof over their head. And this is, if it's done right and if it's maintained, these are structures that can last 100 years. But the cost of this was just outrageously low. It started off kind of high, but I worked very hard with all of my partners and employees over there to get the cost down to just the material cost. So when I first started trying to build a roof churches, I would go to the Congo, and my man there in the Congo would take me to the building supply store, and I would price sheet metal, and I would price timbers, and I would price metal trusses and everything else, and not depend on somebody else to tell me what it was going to cost. I knew what it was going to cost. Wow. And so that brought bringing the cost down to just the cost enabled us to do a whole lot of work over there. So, that last year we roofed 420 churches. And the amazing thing is to think through the lives that a building or a roof will impact. This is a facility that can very easily house 300 people on a Sunday morning or any time that they gather. And it's a facility that very comfortably houses the same number of kids, maybe a few less, but for educational purposes, a primary school in the morning, a secondary school in the afternoon, or vice versa. So you would have hundreds of people who would benefit from these structures. And the roof, the average cost to put a roof on a 30 by 60 building for me in Africa was about $1,600. That's pretty good. Yeah. I wish it were the case here.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. One, were you not concerned about? I'm trying to think of how I can put this. You're a Christian organization.
Yes.
Operating some cases in places that are not Christian.
Yes.
Was that a problem in any way?
If you talk to my wife, she would probably tell you that it was much more of a problem than I would let on. And I, every time I went, I made many trips, and every time I would go there to wherever I was, I would find myself in some, sticky situation, whether it's there's political turmoil going on in Kenya, and there's Somali Muslim fundamentalists coming down into Kenya and destroying malls and shooting people and burning churches. There were all kinds of situations that I'm glad that I don't have to get myself into now, because I would worry about it. But
did you ever feel like there was a target on your back when you were down there?
No, I did. Well, there was one particular time. There was one particular time when I was with my partners, and we were in an old Toyota Land Cruiser, and we were taking a jungle road. This is in the Congo, in the Kasai area of the Congo, where there's no pavement anywhere, and there are very few dirt roads anywhere. And we found ourselves stuck with and surrounded by people with machetes that were banging on this Land Cruiser and angry because they wanted us to give them everything that we had, give them money. And I was perfectly willing to do that, but but I was along for the ride, and my partners were not going to go along with that. And I thought, I'm not going to make it out of this alive. There were other situations that were like that, but I always had the Lord's hand on me, and He always brought me home safe. But I think those kind of experiences can take a toll on you, and take a toll on the people that you love, who are hoping that you make it back home.
Well,
as far as the context and the countries that we served in would all be characterized mostly as Christian countries, although you have tribal religions, and you have a growing Muslim population and others, but there were some increasing problems with the relationship between Christians and Muslims. And in Ethiopia, for example, Christians and Muslims have existed side by side, literally in the same small villages, for 500 years. And it's only been recently when outside influences would come in and preach a message of hate that there would be problems. And we had in Kenya and several other places, we had a period of time when a number of our churches were burned by young Islamic fundamentalists that had been ginned up by an imam from Saudi Arabia that came in to preach. So there were growing problems that hadn't existed prior to that time. But I also saw the exact opposite of what many people would expect. You might assume that Muslims and Christians would be at one another's throats, or somebody would be under attack at any given time. But the one wonderful story with a particular church, we built this church. Alex funded the building of the church, and a year later it was burned down along with several others in a small area. And they were sent out to do that by a Saudi imam who had come there to preach. And this happened in Kenya. The people came to what was left of the church, and they were just heartbroken. And when they arrived, the church was actually surrounded by a group of elderly Muslim men from the village, and they had their weapons, and their message was, "We will take care of this. We will handle this problem." And several weeks later, one of those Muslim elders came to the people of that particular congregation who were worshiping under trees now, and provided them with several $1,000s, enough money to rebuild their church. Mm-hmm. That was not the kind of story that would ever be heard here,
right.
But it's something that I witnessed, and it, not just once. There were other occasions too when you would find the exact opposite of what people assume to be happening, and that was a blessing to be able to witness that.
Yeah, what stories you must have. Well, before we get away, one thing we got to get tended to is you got to shine a little light on this $50,000.
my smuggling career.
Your smuggling career, so that the congregation in Kenton, Mississippi will understand that their preacher did not do this as a matter of course.
Yeah, we'll try to clear it up. Keep my job.
Yeah.
Well, throughout the course of I've been in ministry now for over 30 years, and in addition to that 5-year stint serving Alex Booth, I've done a lot of other work in different places of the world, all over India, Mexico, other places of the world, and I had 2 trips actually to Cuba. And the first time that I went to Cuba this is a long time ago, and I'm pretty confident that the statute of limitations has run out on this. But it was something of a covert operation. There was a Protestant organization in Cuba that needed a library in order to train their students, and they didn't have the funds to build a library. What they needed was approximately $50,000. And so it's easy for us to raise that kind of money, especially for that purpose. But how do you get it there? And the problem at the time, I don't know if this is the case, but at the time, you could wire money from the States into Cuba, but the Cuban government would tax it 80%.
80%.
80%. So, we had to find another way to get that money in. And there were several of us. My dad was actually a part of that first trip. And we didn't tell anybody that we were doing this, but we taped cash, U.S. currency, $50,000 to our chest. And I was a lot skinnier at the time, so I could handle a lot of money. And we and you can't just hop on a plane and fly to Havana, or at least you couldn't then. So we flew into Mexico, made a couple of stops, ended up in Merida, Mexico, which is in the middle of the Yucatan, and we flew from Merida to Havana. And once we arrived in Havana, it's so easy to do pretty much wherever you go in the world. But we had to bribe the Cuban customs officials not to stamp our passport, because we were going to go back through Mexico, but ultimately we wanted to come home, and we didn't want to have that stamp on our passport. So we got in. We met our friends in Cuba. We delivered the funds. We got out. We spent a few days visiting around and meeting people in churches, but we got back out and everything was fine. And then there was a need after a couple of years to dedicate the library. By that point in time, things had changed with our government, and it was still illegal to travel, for an American to travel in and out of Cuba. But you could go if you obtained a diplomatic license. So with the help of a Mississippi senator, we got diplomatic licenses, and we were able to travel back into the same place, meet the same people, and celebrate the construction of a beautiful, huge, beautiful library.
But this time you didn't have $50,000.
But I didn't have to do. I didn't have to. I could go as a dignitary preacher and not a smuggler.
Okay. Well, Steve, there are 1,000 stories and there's a million more I'd like to get into, but I expect we're probably going to have to shut this one down. I appreciate very much your time, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you on a private basis to maybe get a little more educated than we are now.
I appreciate you, and I appreciate your friendship and who you are and what you do, bringing these stories together and sharing your wisdom. I love your YouTube channel.
They're fun to do. Okay, brother. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. I hope you enjoyed meeting him. He's a good man, and I like him. Oh, and did I tell you, he plays a mean guitar. I'm Jim Ritchie, and I'll see you again next time.